Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. This is all of my pickups for the last half of February, and there's not a huge amount here, so hopefully this video will be pretty quick. But in saying that, there are some titles I'm pretty excited about, so I hope you guys enjoy, and I'll just get straight into it. So first of all, with my anime, I got the most recent Hunter x Hunter 2011 release, which is Phantom Rouge. This is the sort of complementary film, like most shonen popular anime. They tend to get films that don't really fit into canon, but are pretty enjoyable in their own way. Phantom Rouge is an interesting one because a lot of the story, a solid part of Kurapika's story, was written by Togashi himself, so there is cause to regard it as canon to the series. It gives background on his life before going out and becoming a hunter and sort of his motivations, which are only sort of glanced on in the normal series of Hunter x Hunter. And in that regard, it is a very interesting film, but aside from that, the other stuff going on is not, it's pretty typical shonen franchise film. It's a bit ridiculous. The characters act kind of not exactly out of character, because I do think a lot of the characters, the main characters especially, do stay in character. But it's always a weird situation. They have to have an antagonist and they have to have all this stuff going on. This is the better of the two Hunter x Hunter films, in my opinion. But in saying that, it's not great. It's not something you have to go see unless you really want to know more about Kurapika. So for those who are buying the anime and are a real completionist, it's great that Viz has licensed and released this one. But it's not like, I wouldn't recommend it if you're not a fan of Hunter x Hunter. It's not gonna encourage you to watch the series, I don't think. And even if you are a fan of Hunter x Hunter, it's not exactly canon material, so it is pretty skippable if you don't want to see it. This release was put out by Viz, like all of the 2011 Hunter x Hunter Blu-ray releases. This is a DVD and Blu-ray release. And it has this pretty metallic-y O-card, which is pretty swish. But aside from that, pretty standard release, in line with what is being released for Hunter x Hunter right now anyway. It is a good timing for this film to come out because where we are in the episodes being released in English, this film slots in pretty perfectly. But yeah, like I said, it's not a must-have, but if you are a fan and if you've already seen this or you've been curious about it, or even if you just want to see the Kurapika stuff, it is worth it for that, but it's not like a great film. And interestingly, both this and the other Hunter x Hunter film, animation-wise, seems a lot lower than the typical television series, which is pretty surprising considering usually films get a larger budget. And I don't know whether it was due to sort of constraints or a different team working on it or whatever, because these films did come out whilst the anime was also still airing. But you have to wonder how things could look like a certain way in the television show compared to this film, which is only 90 minutes or however long. So yeah, it's not the best franchise film I've even seen. There are certainly better ones, but it's not I don't think it's totally skippable, although it is a bit ridiculous and it doesn't quite fit into the world that Togashi has built up until this point. But it's interesting. It's not anything you have to put a huge amount of brain power into if you're watching it, and it's a interesting addition to the franchise as a whole, if only for the background of Kurapika. So, yeah. So next is the Funimation limited edition release of 91 Days. This is a series that I've described as sort of an animated version of a Hollywood gangster drama. It's very reminiscent of something like The Godfather or the other multitudes of gangster films there are. It's the sort of show that really makes you question why it was animated, because it could work just as well as a live action piece, and that's not a bad thing. I think it has a level of story to it that you don't typically see in your normal anime, and because of that, it's an interesting comparison to other gangster anime, even like Bakugo, which does have that fantastical element of alchemy to it. It's wonderful. I love this series. It came out last year, the year before. I can't quite remember, but it is a pretty typical revenge story. The main character trying to get revenge on the death of his family that happened 10 years before, and to do so, reinventing himself and sort of going, not undercover, but infiltrating, that's the word I'm looking for, infiltrating the enemy, getting them to trust him under this new persona, and then sort of the consequences of that. It's a fascinating but pretty standard story for this genre, but not necessarily for anime. The limited edition Funimation release is very nice. I know some people complain that the postcards are on the outside of the box, but I don't really care too much. I never really look at them anyway. This is one of Funimation's newer limited editions where it has just the single Blu-ray case for DVD and Blu-ray, and then a booklet or postcards or whatever else, similarly to the Yuri on Ice limited edition I got previously in the last pickup video. And I really like this sort of limited edition. It's the type of release that Viz has been doing for like Ranma and a couple other things, but Ranma really being the one that I personally own and sticks out to me. It's also similar to a lot of Anime Limited's releases, which are digipacks rather than the actual keep case. Sailor Moon is another one that Viz does. I really like sort of the streamlined design. It's thinner, so you can get a lot more of these sorts of limited editions on your shelf, but you still get that level of quality for a limited edition release. You get the chipboard box, you get the booklet, and you get the show, of course. I'm not a huge fan of a lot of like Sentai level premiums, just because I don't use physical extras a huge amount. So I don't care if a show or a release has a t-shirt or a keychain or a lanyard or stickers or whatever else. Those don't really appeal to me at all, which is why the only limited edition I do have from Sentai is the Chihaya Furu one, which is a beautiful release, don't get me wrong. And Sentai's releases are always very, very nice, but it's standard size, DVD size, as well as only really having the space for the discs themselves, as well as some booklet extras. So that's like the perfect way to do it, in my opinion. And that's why I haven't, aside from not wanting to collect the show, but that's why I haven't really always encouraged things like the Food Wars limited edition or Umaru, or 90% of the ones they release. I am more of a fan of their just standard DVD size box set releases. But in saying that, like I said, Funimation has moved to this sort of more streamlined version of their previous limited edition, so they only have the one case compared to the two. And I think that's a good idea, because a lot of times a series will have like this wider box for a show that is only 11 or 12 episodes long. Something like Princess Jellyfish, it has the 2 cases, and while it's lovely to have it, and the Princess Jellyfish limited edition is beautiful, I adore mine, it would make more sense for it to be in a release like this, where it doesn't need a huge amount of extra packaging and casing and all of that else. Yeah, so I'm glad that this seems to be the direction that Funimation is going. Whether or not they decide to start putting their postcards on the inside, that won't really affect it a huge amount, I don't think. But yeah, I'm just really glad that I'm able to finally own the show as well. I did put it off for a little while. But it's a lovely release for a great show. If you haven't tried it yet, it is on Crunchyroll. It's well worth the watch, especially if you're wanting sort of a darker, almost Hollywood-esque sort of story. It's really good. I do recommend it. So, starting with manga, we have the most recent volume of Delicious in Dungeon, Volume 4 by Ryoko Kui. This is one of Yen Press's recent licenses. It just started being released in English last year, and was my most surprising favorite of last year. This series really wasn't on my radar up until the 2nd or 3rd volume came out, and then I finally tried it. It is amazing. Definitely a really well balanced comedy. It's never mean-spirited or like has any malice towards certain characters, which I think is something that comedy can fall into sometimes. Kui has done a great job blending her interesting sort of typical Dungeons and Dragons or fantasy world with a pretty typical cooking manga, and it's done really well with a lot of creativity. I've said this before in regards to this series, but if you're a fan of something like Sweetness and Lightning or What Did You Eat Yesterday, cooking manga that actually gives you realistic recipes and breaks down how they're made and all of that, compared to a cooking manga like Food Wars or even a Toriko. This is a series for you to try. It's really down-to-earth, funny, clever, and just really, really likable. All of the characters are pretty wonderful. And with this volume, we finally get to sort of the main goal of the series, at least insofar. How it goes from here will be seen. And I'm pretty interested to see how this series develops from this point. It's really, really, really good. I definitely recommend it. Even if you, or especially if you haven't tried it just because of the name, it's really interesting. And like, I'm not the biggest fan of like isekais and this trend to certain fantasy tropes being everywhere in manga and light novels these days, but this one doesn't really fall into those tropes. It has a lot more to it than just like, oh, a fantasy world and all this and that. It's sort of just the placeholder for the setting, and it's done really, really, really well. There's ways that it could have been done really lazily, and luckily Kui does not subject us to that. Very, very fun little manga from Yen Press, and I highly recommend it to everyone. Next, we have the most recent volume of Kase-san and so this is Kase-san and an Apron, the 4th volume of this Yuri manga by Hiromi Takashima. And again, I've said this with this manga before, but this is a great starter series for people who've never read Yuri before or are sort of interested but don't know where to start. It's, in my opinion, it has a lot more of a spine than some of the more fluffy, like, milquetoast Yuri that you find currently being released. But it still has elements of that. Like, it's very sweet and lighthearted and just overall nice, but it still does address things like being physically attracted to the same gender and all those sorts of things, comparatively to something like, I don't know, a Milk Morinaga title, which that's not to say anything bad about Milk Morinaga, but it doesn't necessarily have that same level to it. This is a very, very, very popular series in Japan for good reason, although it does take a while for volumes to come out. I think we've finally caught up with the Japanese release, so when the next volume comes out, I don't know, but it is certainly a great Yuri. It's my favorite Yuri coming out currently, I mean, aside from Sweet Blue Flowers, but I don't necessarily classify them as the same things. Those two, I mean, Yuri has really made huge breakthroughs in the market this past year, and I hope that just continues to happen, because there's been a absolute flood of wonderful Yuri in the market, stuff that I would highly recommend. Things from Bloomin' to You, as well as After Hours, something Darling for my, whatever that one is, Kiss for My Darling, Sweet Lily, or whatever. I don't remember the name of that title. I wasn't a huge fan of, just because it was very unfocused, but it is a pretty solid new Yuri series coming out as well. There's been a lot, as well as sort of the typical one-shot releases as well. And this coming year we do have some other titles. One that I'm really interested in called Hungry for You, which sort of seems like a vampire-esque series, which I'm totally down for. It's nice to see that more variety of Yuri is coming into English, so it's not just like the private schoolgirl, forbidden love thing that you see from like Maria Watches Over Us and that, which was pretty typical of what you could find in Yuri up until now. So I'm very happy for this change. It's a good direction we're going with this market. But like I said, kase-san and wonderful series, great Yuri, especially for someone not necessarily familiar with the sort of demographic as a whole. It's sweet. Both characters, kase-san and Yamada, are pretty proactive in their relationship, as well as solving their problems, and as characters they have a lot of character. Neither of them are sort of just this, oh, this is the trope, so that's how they act, which is really refreshing as well. So I do really recommend this, especially if you're a Yuri fan. If you're not, it's a good place to start. It's just a solid little series. Finally, for manga, we have I Hear the Sunspot Theory of Happiness by Yuki Fumino. This is the BL title, which follows two university students, one who's hard of hearing, the other who takes his notes because of that. The first volume was sort of a surprise license from One Piece Books, and I don't know if they ever formally announced that they were continuing it, but this is the second volume of that series. I know the third volume, I don't know if it's been released in Japan yet, but I know there's chapters for a third volume. So this is far from the end, it seems, but this is a much thicker volume than the first. It's almost double the size of the first one, so you're definitely getting your money worth. I'm pretty sure it's the same price. Really solid follow-up to the first volume. The first volume and the series as a whole is not, it does fall much more on the shonenai side of the spectrum rather than like the hard yaoi stuff. So if you're wanting, like with Kase-san, and this is a great starter series. It's pretty approachable. It has a lot more to it than just necessarily developing a romance between the characters. There are other things story-wise going on. And it's posing larger questions about how society handles disability, which is great to see, especially in a manga like this where one of the characters is disabled and it's not just used as like a gimmick or a character quote-unquote quirk. It's similar to A Silent Voice in that it handles the topic of deafness or being hard of hearing very, very well, very respectfully, and shows the side, like, it doesn't treat it as like a pitiful existence, but it does show the realities of living with a disability, especially one that's so hidden to a lot of people and that people don't necessarily understand. And this volume in particular takes that direction a lot stronger than maybe the first volume did, which is a great thing to see. Like, nothing is just fully resolved at the end of the first volume, and this just continues from there. A new character is introduced in this volume who is also hard of hearing, and rather than just acting as sort of a motivation for jealousy or anything like that, she brings another layer to the discussion and to how disabled people are treated and how they feel because of that. It's done really, really well. I commend Fumino for her work in regards to that. This volume also develops the relationship and sort of resolves a lot of things that were left hanging in the first volume. So in just that regards, it is good to read, but it's nice to see this series handle a lot of topics that aren't necessarily easy to discuss, just in general, but also especially in like a comic or manga format. And especially for a genre that has such a bad reputation like BL. So it's really, really, really nice to have a BL series like this one being released. Like I said with Kase-san, and last year was definitely a step in the right direction for Yuri publishing and licensing. The variety of Yuri manga that we've gotten over the last year and over this coming year has really improved, and I hope I hear a Sunspot and some other titles like Go For It Nakamura are indicative that this change is happening for BL as well. BL has always had a pretty wide variety of setting for its manga that's been licensed, but not necessarily for the type of story that's being presented or written. So being able to see these titles, as well as the how well certain LGBT titles like My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness and My Brother's Husband and Sweet Blue Flowers, is really, really encouraging. I hope we see more of it over this year, and I know what I'll be picking up. So yeah, I Hear the Sunspot, definitely a really good volume. If you didn't know that this series had a second volume, this is it. It's out now. Time to pick it up. It's well worth it. And definitely if you're a fan of the first volume or the series in general, it's a must-have. One Piece Books has done a great job with this release, and I'm really looking forward to volume 3. So that's everything that I got for this last half of February. Not a huge amount, but still some solid titles, I think. As for next month, I do have my typical like ongoing manga pre-ordered that I always do, but I also have an art book, so look forward to that, as well as a couple anime films, one which is an older title, well, technically both are older titles, but both are sort of newer releases of those films. One is much older than the other, but one I've been waiting for excitedly for so long, so hopefully those will come in time for my next pickups video, and I hope you guys enjoy. Tell me what you got over this last month in the comments if you like, or your opinions on these particular titles. And I'll catch you in the next video, guys. Bye till then.